turn now to the Middle East. Israel launching airstrikes and shelling Syria in retaliation for a weekend of rocket attacks.
On November 4th, a group of Iranian students aligned with Khomeini's religious agenda invaded the U.S. Embassy. More than 60 American hostages were seized.
We continue to hold the government of Iran responsible for the safety and for the early release of the American hostages who have been held so long.
Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem saw some of the fiercest fighting.
In 1967, Syria started a process that would stir up Middle East tensions and unite the Arab states in a war against their hated neighbor, Israel.
Now, some very, very sketchy details reaching us here at Sky Centre. Important enough to bring to you, though, at this early stage. We believe that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center in New York.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
We talk about the Middle East like it's a cursed place, doomed to violence, chaos, and instability, as if there's something in the soil or in the people that makes peace impossible there. After 9/11, that myth hardened into something uglier. A whole generation in the West was taught that Arabs and Muslims are irrational, violent, and incapable of self-rule, that the wars we fought against them were necessary, that our occupation of their land was justified, and that any resistance on their part to our actions was terrorism, plain and simple. But that narrative is not supported by the weight of the historical evidence. For centuries, under the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East was relatively stable, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and governed by a system that, while flawed, maintained order. The chaos we now associate with the Middle East didn't begin until European imperial powers carved up the region after World War I. And it wasn't until the creation of the State of Israel, without the consent of the people who lived there, that the modern era of unending conflict truly began. That event, the founding of Israel, wasn't just controversial. It was catastrophic for the Arab and Muslim world. And the backlash to it has shaped nearly every major political development in the region ever since. This backlash was not driven by blind hatred or anti-Semitism. It was driven by credible political grievances, such as mass displacement, military defeat, occupation, and the humiliation of seeing Western powers once again impose their will on the region, this time permanently. But instead of addressing those grievances, the West chose to crush the resistance, often through war, sanctions, coups, or proxy regimes. And every time people in the region pushed back, the same narrative would return, that they were violent, irrational, or uncivilized. Now we're on the verge of another war, this time with Iran. A war that, once again, is being framed as a battle against religious extremism, instability, and terrorism. But this is just the next chapter in a much older story. The long war between the West and the political will of the Muslim world. A war that began with Israel and cannot end until the political crisis at its heart is finally resolved. This video is about how we got here, and why, unless we face the truth about Israel's role in the region, there will never be peace in the Middle East. The popular notion that the Middle East is inherently violent or unstable is a myth. A convenient story invented by the West to paint the region as hopelessly violent and backwards. For most of its history, especially under the Ottoman Empire, the region was far more politically stable, religiously tolerant, and economically interconnected than Europe was. Christians, Jews, and Muslims coexisted within a framework that, while imperfect, was functional and enduring. The chaos we now associate with the Middle East is not something native to the land or the people. It was engineered. It's a modern phenomenon, largely the result of imperial intervention. The most pivotal catalyst for this instability that has plagued the region for decades was the founding of the State of Israel, a geopolitical decision whose consequences even its architects could not have fully foreseen. The widespread resistance that emerged across the Arab and Muslim world in response to Israel's creation is often dismissed in the West as irrational hatred or anti-Semitism. But let's be clear, that resistance, especially in the first few decades of the conflict, was not about hating Jews. It was about the specific way in which Israel was created, through decisions made by Western powers, beginning with the Balfour Declaration and the UN Partition Plan, in the heart of the Arab world, on land already inhabited by hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and with full Western backing and impunity as violence escalated. That creation, without local consent and against the will of the region's inhabitants, unleashed a century of backlash and resistance that still defines the Middle East to this day. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, much of the Arab world didn't gain independence. Control was simply handed over to European colonial powers. Britain and France carved up the region into mandates, protectorates, and spheres of influence, controlling territories like Egypt, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. These weren't temporary arrangements. They were full-fledged colonial regimes that dictated borders, installed kings, and suppressed nationalist movements. It wasn't until the mid-20th century, just as the State of Israel was being created, that many of these countries finally began to gain their own independence. Syria in 1946, Jordan in 1946, Lebanon in 1943, and Egypt in 1952. In other words, the same generation of Arabs who watched European flags come down also watched a new Western-backed imperialist project rise in their midst. Just as colonialism was supposedly ending, a new form of power, settler colonialism in the eyes of the region's Arabs, was taking root, this time with permanent consequences. To the newly independent Arab states, the creation of Israel wasn't just another geopolitical development. It was a deeply symbolic affront. Worse, it came at the direct expense of the Palestinian people, whose displacement and dispossession were seen as a collective Arab wound. So when the Arab states went to war with Israel for the first time in 1948, they did so not only to defend Palestine, but to assert their own sovereignty, unity, and post-colonial agency. But they failed, and failed catastrophically. Israel not only survived, it expanded. And the pattern repeated in 1956, in 1967, and again in 1973. Arab coalitions launched military campaigns to reclaim land and dignity, and in most cases, they were decisively defeated. None more devastating than the Six-Day War in 1967, in which Israel captured significant amounts of territory from its Arab neighbors in under a week. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a collapse of identity, dignity, and political agency. Now, importantly, these early conflicts were not about religion. Today, there's a tendency, especially in Israeli and Western narratives, to paint all Arab opposition to Israel as religious fundamentalism or irrational Jew hatred. Israel often draws a direct line from the secular Arab governments it fought in the mid-20th century to the Islamist militant groups it battles today, as if all resistance to Israel has always been rooted in anti-Semitic zealotry. But that is simply not true. The Arab regimes that went to war with Israel, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, were all secular nationalist governments, especially during the 1950s through the 1970s. These were not religious regimes. They were secular nationalist states, and many of them were openly hostile to Islamist movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, which they often repressed with violence. For these governments, the conflict with Israel was not a religious holy war. It was a political and anti-colonial struggle. Zionism was seen not as a spiritual or theological threat, but as a geopolitical project backed by the very Western powers that had long dominated the region. The creation of Israel was understood as the latest chapter in a broader history of foreign imposition and national humiliation. In that light, the Palestinian cause quickly became a pan-Arab cause, a symbol of collective resistance that united deeply divided regimes around a shared demand for dignity, sovereignty, and justice. For these governments, opposition to Israel became a political necessity. It rallied the public, unified populations, and distracted from domestic crises like poverty, inequality, and repression. For Nasser and Egypt in particular, anti-Zionism became a defining pillar of pan-Arab identity, a way to project leadership, dignity, and defiance across the region. By the time of the 1967 war, Arab leaders were still deeply scarred by the trauma of 1948, and the slogan, "Palestine is Arab," had become a rallying cry, not just for Palestinians, but for an entire generation of Arabs trying to reclaim a sense of pride and agency. While Palestinian nationalism certainly existed, it was subsumed into the broader project of Arab nationalism, especially under Egypt's leadership. Religion was not central to this early stage of resistance. In fact, these secular regimes often saw Islamists as a threat, not an ally. Further proof that the Arab-Israeli conflict in the early decades was not rooted in theology, but in the unfinished business of colonialism and national liberation. It wasn't until after 1979, with the Iranian Revolution and the eventual rise of Islamist movements like Hamas in the late 1980s, that religion became central to the narrative of resistance in the Middle East. But even then, the turn to religion wasn't theological in origin, it was political. The rise of Islamist movements across the region was a direct reaction to the failures of secular Arab nationalism. For decades, the Arab world had placed its hopes in modernizing strongmen like Nasser in Egypt and Hafez al-Assad in Syria. These leaders had promised to restore Arab dignity, defeat Israel, and deliver justice and prosperity. But one by one, those hopes were dashed. These regimes lost wars to Israel, became brutally repressive, failed to provide economic and social progress, and often aligned with the same foreign powers they once claimed to oppose. Meanwhile, Palestinians remained stateless, corruption deepened, and Israel grew stronger. Into this vacuum stepped the radical Islamists, who delivered a simple and devastating verdict to their people, saying, "You tried it their way. The generals, the socialists, the revolutionaries, and they gave you nothing but defeat and dishonor. Return to Islam and we'll restore your dignity." That became the rallying cry for groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and eventually Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The Muslim Brotherhood, long marginalized by secular Arab governments from the 1930s through the 1970s, suddenly found its slogan, "Islam is the solution," resonating across the Arab and Muslim world. This wasn't just about theology. It was about reclaiming power, meaning, and moral clarity after decades of political betrayal. As the authoritarian secular Arab regimes destroyed civil society and crushed dissent, the only space they couldn't fully close was the mosque. Mosque, Islamic charities, and Quranic schools became the last surviving infrastructure of public life, the only safe place to organize, learn, and resist. In that sense, Muslim social institutions became what the Black church was during the Civil Rights era in America, not just places of worship, but a place of political refuge and social cohesion. Even for those who weren't radical, Islam became the language of protest. This wasn't just about religious revival, it was a political and psychological revolution. After decades of national humiliation, Islam re-emerged as a framework for justice, dignity, and resistance. It offered what secular regimes could not: community, purpose, and the promise of redemption. That's why it endures till today. Not because people want violence, but because they want to matter. And the first major rupture that proved this could work was Iran's 1979 revolution, a movement that shook the entire Muslim world and reshaped people's understanding of what was possible. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was a turning point, not just for Iran, but for the entire Muslim world. It was the first time in modern history that an Islamic movement successfully overthrew a secular, Western-backed monarchy and replaced it with a government rooted explicitly in Islamic principles. Ayatollah Khamenei didn't just challenge the Shah, he challenged the entire Western political order that had propped up regimes like his. And he did it not in the name of socialism, nationalism, or liberalism, but in the name of God. Khomeini proved that Islam could function not only as a private faith, but as a comprehensive political system. For millions of Muslims across the region, especially those disillusioned by the failures of secular nationalism, Iran's revolution was living proof that Islamism could work, and that a revolution grounded in faith could defeat a powerful Western ally. It lit a fire across the region that continues to burn today. The next major flashpoint came later that same year with the siege of Mecca, an event that rocked the foundations of the Islamic world. While Saudi Arabia hadn't fought Israel directly, it was widely seen as complicit in the broader system of Western imperial influence in the region. It supported U.S. foreign policy, normalized economic and military ties with the West, and consistently failed to act meaningfully on behalf of Palestine, despite being the custodian of Islam's holiest sites. For many Islamist radicals, Saudi Arabia represented everything they despised: a hypocritical regime sitting atop Mecca and Medina, serving foreign imperial powers, enriching itself with oil money, and silencing authentic Islamic voices at home. The tension exploded in 1979 when armed Islamist militants seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca, declaring the monarchy corrupt and un-Islamic. The regime was unable to contain the uprising on its own and was forced to call in French special forces, non-Muslims disguised as Muslims, to retake the mosque, an act that caused theological outrage across the Muslim world. Though the siege was eventually crushed, the monarchy was deeply shaken by the uprising's popular resonance, particularly among young Saudis. In its aftermath, the Saudi royal family made a Faustian bargain. To preserve its power, it would double down on Wahhabi Islam, the kingdom's ultra-conservative religious doctrine and export this ideology abroad to Pakistan, Afghanistan, Egypt, Sudan, and beyond. In exchange, it hoped to keep domestic radicals in check and maintain royal authority. But this strategy didn't contain the fire, it spread it. The Saudi state, seeking self-preservation, ended up becoming one of the largest funders of the radicalization it claimed to oppose. That same year, 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. For the Saudi regime, it presented the perfect opportunity to export jihadism as a way to preserve its legitimacy. The United States, viewing the invasion through the lens of the Cold War, launched Operation Cyclone, one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in CIA history. Together, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan funneled billions into training, arming, and ideologically supporting the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets. This event, not 9/11, marked the beginning of global jihadism. Religious militants, once seen as extremists, were now framed as freedom fighters in a holy war against godless foreign occupiers, first against the Soviets and later against the West and Israel. It was in this moment that Osama bin Laden emerged. A wealthy Saudi from an elite family, bin Laden had been deeply affected by the Mecca siege and found his calling in Afghanistan. He used his family wealth and connections to build infrastructure, roads, camps, and eventually a jihadist network. While the CIA did not fund him directly, they built the environment in which bin Laden thrived and turned a blind eye to the ideological radicalization that was taking place, so long as the fighters were anti-communist. When the Soviets finally withdrew in 1989, the US largely abandoned Afghanistan. But for bin Laden and others who had just defeated a foreign superpower through jihad, the next logical target was clear: America itself. In their eyes, the US had become the quote-unquote far enemy, the protector of Israel, the guarantor of the Saudi monarchy, and the occupier of Islamic Holy Land with its military bases, and the country responsible for the sanctions, bombings, and devastation going on in Iraq at the time. This perceived desecration and domination formed the core of al-Qaeda's ideology. Strike the far enemy, the West, and the corrupt regimes of the Islamic world, the quote-unquote near enemy, would crumble. And that road, of course, would lead to 9/11. But for the people of Iraq, or Palestine, or Afghanistan, or Iran, the story did not begin on September 11, 2001. It began much earlier, in 1917, with the Balfour Declaration, when Britain promised to help create a Jewish homeland in a land already inhabited by Arabs. In 1948, with the Nakba, the mass displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians during the founding of Israel. Or in 1953, when the CIA orchestrated a coup in Iran to reinstall a Western-friendly monarchy. Or in 1967, with the Arab-Israeli War and the humiliating defeat of the Arab states. Or 1979, with the stationing of US troops in Saudi Arabia, the Mecca siege, and the Iranian Revolution. In the 1980s, with US and Saudi-backed jihad in Afghanistan, and again in 1991 during the Gulf War when the US established military bases on what many Muslims saw as sacred land. What we witnessed on 9/11 wasn't the beginning. It was blowback to decades of American and Western foreign policy in the Middle East that started with Western support for the establishment and expansion of Israel. Blowback doesn't mean justification, but it does mean recognition. Recognition that no act of violence occurs in a vacuum. What we call terrorism is not born from theology alone. It's a political symptom. And for decades, the West has refused to treat the disease, choosing instead to respond with drone strikes, regime change, and overly simplistic explanations for the region's many crises. And yet, after the towers fell, none of this mattered. The clock was reset. Suddenly, the violence was unprovoked, and the story began with our pain, not theirs. And when it came time to explain why this had happened, why a group of people could be radicalized to hate America enough to commit such a heinous act of terrorism against innocent American citizens, we were told that they hate us for our freedom. That wasn't just a bad explanation. It was a deliberate lie, engineered to erase decades of American involvement in the Middle East, to reframe retaliation as senseless barbarism, and to justify an open-ended war on terror that would go on to kill, displace, and radicalize millions more. Once that lie took hold, any action by the US or Israel, no matter how disproportionate or aggressive, became legitimate self-defense. And any resistance, no matter how historical or contextual, was terrorism. None of this is to justify what happened on 9/11. It was a moral horror. But understanding is not excusing. We ask why mass shooters act. We study how tyrants came to power. We investigate the roots of genocide and coups, not to sympathize, but to stop them from happening again. Because you can't fix what you refuse to name. And what America still refuses to name is its own role as an empire whose interventions in this part of the world have led to greater instability, destruction, and needless suffering. And now, the same tropes, distortions, and fear tactics that justified the war on terror are being recycled, this time to lay the groundwork for war with Iran. It's not just déjà vu, it's intentional. The rhetoric is all too familiar. They're irrational, they're religious extremists, they hate our freedom, they threaten global security. These were the same talking points that were used to justify the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, to silence Palestinian grievances, and to dismiss any form of resistance in the Muslim world. Now they're being repackaged, targeting Iran. What the US and Israel do is invert cause and effect. Iran's actions, which are often responses to decades of sanctions, assassinations, covert sabotage, and regional isolation, are framed as unprovoked aggression. Meanwhile, Israel's expansion, its occupation of Palestinian land, and its repeated bombing campaigns across the region are never labeled as destabilizing. It's Iran's reaction that's treated as the problem. Iran is not hostile because it is irrational. It is hostile because it has endured over 70 years of humiliation, threats, and encirclement, much of it orchestrated by the very powers now accusing it of extremism. But by portraying Iran as a radical theocracy, the US and Israel tap directly into the dehumanizing logic built during the war on terror. Arabs and Muslims are not rational political actors. They're emotionally unstable, they're religiously extreme, they don't value human life like we do, and therefore, violence against them is always preemptive, always necessary, and always justified. Iran's ideological war with Israel isn't only about Palestine. It's about redeeming what many in the Muslim world see as the greatest humiliation of the modern era: the repeated military defeats of Arab states at the hands of Israel. Those defeats shattered the promises of secular Arab nationalism. Then came the Iranian Revolution in 1979, bearing a different banner: Islam is the solution. And to make that more than just a slogan, the Islamic Republic set its sights on achieving what the secular regimes could not, taking on and hopefully defeating the Zionist regime in Israel, which had become the living symbol of Muslim defeat and Western domination. That, in Tehran's eyes, is the ultimate proof of Islamic legitimacy. So yes, Iran's hostility toward Israel is performative, theological, and geopolitical all at once. It's not just about territory or politics, it's a bid for leadership of the Muslim world. If Iran were to seriously weaken or defeat Israel, it wouldn't just win a war, it would claim a divine mandate. Iran could position itself as the rightful heir to the Prophet Muhammad's mission in modern times, succeeding where the Arab world had failed. That's why Iran armed Hezbollah and built proxy networks across the region. That's why it acted in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. Because for Iran, this isn't just about survival. It's about spiritual authority, historical redemption, and civilizational destiny. And it's also why Israel doesn't see Iran as just another geopolitical adversary, but as an existential, ideological enemy whose very religious mission centers on Israel's destruction. But the truth is, the real threat to stability in the Middle East has never been Islam. It has never been Iran. It has never even been armed resistance among Arabs. The true and enduring threat is Western imperial domination, the long-standing denial of dignity and agency to the people of the region, and the moral erasure of their right to say no. At the center of that dynamic stands Israel, not because Israel alone caused all the region's problems, but because its creation, survival, and aggressive expansion were the match dropped into the post-colonial tinderbox. Palestine was where Arabs expected justice after colonial rule, and instead got betrayal. Israel's military victories became devastating Arab defeats. The West's unwavering support for Israel made the US and Europe complicit in those defeats. Arab dictators paid lip service to the Palestinian cause, but delivered nothing. And so the people, disillusioned and dishonored, turned to religion, not just as faith, but as the last remaining vehicle for dignity and redemption. At the heart of Israel's national story is the narrative of perpetual survival, the belief that its survival as a state requires total, unbroken dominance. that in order to exist, Israel must win militarily 100% of the time, because its enemies only need to succeed once to destroy it. This logic, born from the trauma of the Holocaust and generations of Jewish persecution, has become the justification for nearly every action the Israeli state takes. Occupation becomes defense, bombings become deterrence, expansion becomes necessity. And under this framework, any perceived threat is existential, because survival isn't just one priority among many for the Israeli state. It is the only priority. That's the psychology of trauma, rooted in the lived memory of genocide. The Nazi Holocaust was a horrifying expression of irrational hatred, one unprovoked by any wrongdoing on the part of the Jewish people. But the hostility Israel faces from Arabs and Muslims in the world today is not irrational. It's not metaphysical anti-Semitism. It's a legitimate political grievance grounded in history, experience, and injustice. And that difference matters. What Israel has never been willing to fully recognize is that the logic of never again cannot be used to justify another people's daily degradation. Survival at the expense of justice will never bring peace. Israel and the Middle East will never be stable as long as they keep looking for military solutions to political problems. Military victories may defeat enemies, at least temporarily, but they do not erase grievances. Every time Israel quote-unquote wins, it deepens the resentment, hardens the opposition, and fuels the fire for justice. That resentment creates radicals, martyrs, and movements, which Israel then tries to suppress again, perpetuating the very cycle it claims to be ending. And when people's cries for dignity and liberation are met not with negotiation, but with bombs and bullets, the lesson becomes clear. Only violence speaks back to violence. The ruling classes of America and Israel are now arguing that getting rid of the Iranian regime will solve the region's problems. But the problem was never with any singular Arab or Muslim regime. Not Khomeini, not Assad, not even Hamas. The deeper issue is that millions across the Arab and Muslim world see Israel not as a country, but as a living, daily injustice. Not because of who its people are, but because of what the state represents and how it was imposed. A Western-backed project established without their consent, maintained through violence, and responsible for decades of regional humiliation. Until that perception changes, until Palestinians are free and Israel becomes something other than an occupying power, no regime change will ever bring lasting peace. The ongoing Gaza war made that point unmistakably clear. The world watched an entire population trapped and brutalized and saw that Israel could do it with total impunity. That wasn't just a war. It was a message to every Muslim around the world. We can brutalize your people, your leaders will stay silent, your mosques will protest, your UN will weep, but nothing will change. That kind of violence doesn't kill resistance, it guarantees it. Israel was meant to be the answer to Jewish suffering, a refuge from centuries of persecution, a homeland where Jews could finally be safe. But the tragic irony is that the state of Israel has created safety for no one, not Jews, not Palestinians, not anyone in the region. Instead, it has entrenched a permanent state of war. Jews living in New York or London do not wake up to sirens warning of rockets, nor do they live with the constant fear of retaliation from those whose lands have been taken and lives upended. The desire for safety is real. The trauma of the Jewish people is real. But true safety, for anyone in the region, Jewish or not, will never come as long as the political questions raised by Israel's creation and ongoing expansion remain unanswered.